Hi, everyone. We better start. It's 7 o'clock already. Okay, so a brief recap. We always like to recap, but you have got videos you can recap. So remember the journey to get here. We've talked about motivation or the lack of it, that feeling of meh. We've talked about how to manage that feeling through routines. We've talked about protecting the prefrontal cortex, and we're going to mention that again tonight. And we've talked about the react and the response nervous system, and where are you in your nervous system day to day. And today we're going to be talking about memory and learning. We will reference that stuff on motivation. I've been talking to lots of young people this week that desperately want to work and are finding it really hard because of distraction, because of feeling kind of demotivated. So we'll kind of link those two things together, and we're going to start by kind of focusing on this kind of idea of why is my memory so rubbish and what can I do about it? How many times do we say to ourselves, I've got a really rubbish memory? Loads of people say that. When I talk to children about their memories, I say, what's your memory like? Oh, it's really rubbish. I was talking to a lovely girl today who was like, I've done my 12 times table. I've done it. I've got it. I said, well, let's just do a bit. And then she's like, I've forgotten it. And she's right. She had forgotten it, but that's not because she's got a rubbish memory. It's because she's thinking about her memory in the wrong way. There's a couple of memories. There's three sorts of memory, but we're going to talk about the ones that we kind of think about mostly. So your memory isn't rubbish. Your memory is amazing. It's incredible. But we just need to understand how our memory works. It's not like a filing cabinet, and our memories are not kind of unchanging. In fact, every time we pull our memory out, there's a chance that it might change as well. So we're going to look at memory, we're going to look at forgetting, and as always, we're going to look at the habits that we need to build daily to help our memory, our long-term memory. Ultimately, in terms of learning at school, and actually, if you think about skills in life, it's going to be long-term memory. So it's how we get information from short-term to long-term memory that's going to be kind of crucial. So you have a short-term memory, and let's describe what that short-term memory is. Basically, at the front of our head, in our prefrontal cortex, that is where short-term memory is. Short-term memory is live firing of neurons. And while we're engaged in an activity, say we're doing a bit of maths work, we're manipulating the bits of the problem, and we're holding them in our attention, that is short-term memory. And when we're listening to something, might be listening to this, we'll be thinking, yeah, I'm going to remember this. I'm going to remember this. I'm going to remember this. And it feels really strongly that we're going to remember it because at the time we are remembering it. And that's because at the time there are neurons firing, literally meaning that we're remembering that information. That's their job. Their job is to recall information that's currently available so it can be manipulated in our mind, linked up with other information to come up with some solutions. So short-term memory is live firing of neurons. Those neurons are there to process experience live, and they can hold maybe 4 items, maybe 7 items, maybe slightly more if we've got more information in our head about that particular item. But short-term memory is no longer effective the moment we stop thinking about whatever it is. It's off doing something else. Short-term memory is engaged in something else, and we've forgotten the details. So it's really important that if we want to remember something that we're experiencing now, like, you're walking along, you've come up with an idea, you need to write it down pretty quickly. If you don't write it down, you are going to forget it initially, unless you've written it down. There are techniques that could keep it in your head, but let's just be safe. Let's write it down. Writing it down, that's an environmental buffer. Basically, we're writing it down, we're storing it. We're going to talk in a while about long-term memory. So long-term memory is different. Short-term memory is electrical firing. Long-term memory is chemical. It's the change in the state of a series of connections across the brain, but also, strangely, the same neurons can be involved in different memories because memory isn't stored in just one place. So let's think of an example. So, say you're recalling a fantastic, let's kind of dream for a second, those times when we used to go on holiday. So, you've gone to a lovely sort of resort in England. You're having a lovely experience, having a great, it's one of those days you just remember, you're maybe flying a kite, you're eating an ice cream, just think about that experience. Now, there's a whole set of experiences that your brain is processing. So you're having the ice cream, that's a sensory kind of taste experience. There's a visual scene. There's the kind of emotions you're having in that experience. There's any particular events that you thoroughly enjoyed. Now, all of those things will fire different sets of neurons across your brain at that moment. And if it's a really important experience that you kind of hold on to, what happens that night is your hippocampus deep in your brain, it's a C-shaped structure, and it kind of runs around a sort of back, but it's in the middle of the brain. The hippocampus deep in the emotional brain, that refires all the neurons that fired live during that experience. So, there might be some in your auditory cortex decoding the sound. There might be something in your visual cortex decoding the vision. There'll be something in your emotional brain, something in your neocortex. All of that is repatterned by your brain at night, and that begins to form a memory. Memory, long-term memory, is also chemical as well. So it's not just the refiring of those neurons, and those neurons start getting bound together. There's this law in neuroscience, which is neurons that fire together wire together, and what hippocampus does is it starts wiring those things together. But memory is also, long-term memory is also a change in the gap between the neurons. We'll look at that as well. First of all, about 3 minutes on what memory is in the brain and how we should think about it, not as like individual spaces, but more a dynamic way the brain responds to a situation. So it's
gradually weaken.
Quite a good video, this. About 3 minutes of this.
Thank you to Brilliant.org for supporting PBS Digital Studios. Sherlock Holmes, the legendary detective, had a theory that the brain is like an attic, where a person can only store a limited amount of memories. Dr. Watson once told him that the Earth travels around the sun. Duh. To which Holmes replied, "Now that I do know it, I shall do my best to forget it." Holmes figured, clutter your attic with random facts and trivia, and you won't have room for the things that matter, like identifying the tiny differences between lethal poisons. Was Holmes right? Is our memory limited, like the storage capacity of a computer, or is our memory unlimited? And if we did have perfect memory, what would life be like if you never forgot anything? The animated film Inside Out depicted memories as glowing spheres stacked in the brain, like books in a library. But the reality is a little more complicated. There's no one place in the brain that serves as our memory bank. Instead, individual memories are scattered all over the brain. Many brain cells in several different regions work together to make one memory. For example, a memory of eating grandma's apple pie might involve some brain cells to help you remember what the pie looked like, others to remember the smell of the cinnamon, and even cells to remember the delicious taste, just to name a few. In reality though, a memory isn't a physical thing that we can find in any given brain cell. It's an action, not an object. Think of baseball fans doing the wave. No single fan is the wave. The magic only happens when all the fans are together doing their thing in a specific order. In the same way, a memory only happens when many connected neurons fire in a specific pattern. And because the same cells can fire in many unique patterns, one group of neurons can encode multiple memories. This increases the memory storage capacity of the brain. Buried deep in the middle of the brain, we find a group of cells shaped like a seahorse, which is why 18th century scientists named this bit the hippocampus. Without your seahorse, you might never remember. We owe a lot of our understanding of memories to one famous patient, known for years only by his initials HM. In 1953, HM underwent a surgery for epilepsy, which demolished most of his hippocampus. For the rest of his life, he exhibited a severe type of amnesia, where he was unable to form new memories of facts or events, but he was still able to remember things he had learned before the surgery. This showed us that the hippocampus is a key to making memories, but that it isn't where memories are stored. So how do experiences become memories? If we look inside the brain of a mouse in a maze, we could draw a kind of map showing which brain cells are active as the mouse experiences something. Later, we could see the mouse's brain cells firing in the same patterns, replaying the experience in fast forward, over and over, backwards and forwards, to make the connections between cells stronger. This is called consolidation, and it's how animals, including humans, commit new memories to long-term storage. Days or weeks later, a smell might trigger the same pattern of cells firing in the mouse brain. A recall of the maze memories, just like smelling cinnamon might trigger memories of grandma for you. But the brain's way of creating memories isn't foolproof. Sometimes our mental replay of something we only imagined can feel as vivid as a real experience. If you picture all the sights, smells, and sounds of a crime scene from someone's description, you activate similar brain networks as if you had really been there. The more you replay the scene in your mind, the more it feels like a real memory. That's why a detective who asks leading questions can inadvertently plant a false memory in a witness. We're able.
So our memory is a kind of really interesting and changeable experience. But the key idea there was that idea of the hippocampus as the site of this process of consolidation. And it's really important as learners that we learn pretty quickly that the best way to get stuff into long-term memory is to routinize that process of consolidation. So memory gets encoded through this process of neurons across the brain being refired at night at speed by the hippocampus. So, say an event unfolds over 30 minutes. Say you're in a lesson and that experience takes 30 minutes. That same experience, when it's being refired at night by the hippocampus, might take 30 seconds. It does it rapidly. It repatterns, it fires those neurons again and starts binding them together through the hippocampus. And over the next night, they're refired again, refired again, refired again. And what begins to change is that the chemicals inside the gaps between the neurons. What we should be teaching our kids is that they need to do some work when they get home that supports memory consolidation. And we'll talk about what that is in a minute. So one event distributed over the brain, refired by the hippocampus overnight, like those little lights firing in the brain, connecting. And that's what the hippocampus is doing in deep NREM sleep. In that first half of a sleep cycle, that is what the hippocampus is doing. It's refiring memories. How does the brain know what to refire and what not to refire? What memories to consolidate and what ones not to consolidate? How does it know that? It knows that on the basis of use. Literally, whichever neurons have been used much during the day, been used a lot, they get repatterned, they get refired, they are much more likely to make it into memory. The ones that aren't used a lot end up being forgotten, literally forgetting. That forgetting is an active process in the brain. So it's really important to understand that we can manage our memory by using our thinking in a particular structured way. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. So basically, memory is what's left over after thinking. So whatever our thinking has been in the day, that is where our hippocampus will refire those neurons because they've been used most. So this means that learning is not one process, but three processes. Learning is understanding the work in the classroom. Learning is practicing that work and refiring those neurons live in the daytime. And learning is recalling that information. And obviously, learning also involves the hippocampus doing its thing at night in terms of memory. So practice in the day refires the brain cells involved in recording the original event, and the hippocampus does that as well. So if we're going to learn things and consolidate them in long-term memory and keep them for months and years, we are going to need to repeat the information in a structured way. Now, the problem with repetition is it's boring, so we need to do it in a structured way. We're going to come to that. And as you refire, this is a neuron. This is deeply nerdy. There are 86 billion of these, and you don't need to know massive amounts about them. But as you refire neurons, what begins to happen is in the gaps at the end of the neuron, those synapses start to change and they get more sensitive to the electricity they're passing down the neuron. They pass that information much more quickly. And every time a neuron fires, it produces a chemical which changes the synapses and makes them stronger. Now, that chemical takes time to make, and it takes time to move out to the synapses. It takes minutes, hours to build up. And when the neuron fires next time, that chemical's in the synapse and strengthens that synapse. Next time the neuron fires, it strengthens that synapse. Next time the neuron fires, it strengthens that synapse. Then what happens is the axon, this myelin sheath, this insulation around the neuron gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And what you get is called long-term potentiation, but you don't need to know that. Basically, you get a thick neuron with a rapid transmission of information jumping to the next neuron. And in a memory across a brain, it might be thousands of interconnected neurons holding that memory, as you saw in that video, like a jigsaw puzzle, all those pieces coming together. So we're going to, if we're going to accelerate our learning, we're going to need to repeat the information in the daytime, which tells our brain that it's important. So the hippocampus is going to strut its funky stuff in the evening and do that repatterning as well. And why do we not remember some things why do we forget or not remember some things in the first place? Well, if we don't remember some things in the first place, we're not really paying massive amounts of attention to them. We haven't brought that information to the front of our heads often enough for the brain to remember it. And also, the brain forgets 70% of every experience it's had, and it's designed to do that. It's designed to do that because if it remembered everything, it would be full after 10 days. So forgetting is an active process in the brain. The brain rubs out connections that haven't been used for a while. And it does that at the rate of 70% of information being shed every day from every experience we've had. So when we have an experience, the brain will forget most of that day within 24 hours. And it continues to do that. And it only remembers three kinds of information. It only remembers stuff that's dangerous, and we can remember that stuff instantly. You know, there are loads of us as adults remember where we were when September the 11th happened. People that are phobic, they're phobic because they've had a really traumatic experience in the past, which has then gets re-triggered in the future. So, you know, someone, for example, that survived a house fire, just the smell of smoke can trigger a flashbulb memory and a really extreme sort of sympathetic nervous system reaction. Brains remember information that's interesting to us and information that's repeated. Those are the sorts of information that gets into long-term memory. We're going to need to use repeat information and tricks to get us to focus and attend to information for longer. More on those tricks a bit more next week. So forgetting keeps the brain clean of information that's extraneous. You know, if our brain was full of information, if it filled itself up, it'd be pretty useless. It wouldn't determine information that's useful to help us live our lives, to help us grow and develop. It would just be full. So we're in this battle. We're in this battle between information that's useful. So if we're playing Fortnite for 6 hours a night and we've learned all those, I don't know, the floss, all those different moves, we've learned all that stuff. We've learned all the, you know, I was talking to a child the other day that could remember all the Pokemon and their evolved forms, but couldn't do their 12 times table. And the reason why was because they'd done the Pokemon stuff to death. They knew it backwards. They'd done it every day, and they really hadn't done much on their 12 times table, apart from do it a few times in school. So, and not remembering things in the first place, maybe we didn't engage enough brain cells, or we didn't have schema, which are memory structures in the head to capture the information for long enough. But actually, a lot of memory, what makes it into memory, is about engagement. The more neurons that are engaged in an activity, the more chance we've got of remembering that activity, and for the hippocampus to kind of fire more neurons and remember that stuff. So now we need to talk about Hermann Ebbinghaus. So in 1880 to 1885, Ebbinghaus conducted some experiments on his own memory, which have been repeated again and again and again. So we've known this stuff about memory for 140 years. We've known this information about Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, this idea that the brain sheds information very quickly within 24 hours. And we need our kids and ourselves to know it. So we need to stop telling ourselves we've got a rubbish memory. We haven't. We've got a very efficient memory, but it only remembers stuff that is important to us. And the brain determines what's important on the basis of use. So if we're going to remember things, we're going to need to refire those neurons more often. So what Ebbinghaus discovered in his experiments on himself, and it's a landmark study, often people don't experiment on themselves. It's not exactly a good random controlled trial, but he did a very thorough experiment on himself, learning nonsense syllables. And then that's been repeated again and again and again. And what he found was if he reviewed the information after one day, well, you can see on the graph, he gets back to 100% retention. And then if he reviews it again a couple of days later, he gets back to 100% retention. And if he reviews the information on the sixth day, he gets back to 100% retention. Now, what neuroscience does now is explain why that is, what's actually going on at the level of the brain. Let's have a look a bit more at the curve of forgetting.
Welcome to Tiny Medicine. This is my newest series, Studying How to Study. This week, I'm going to explain the basis of spaced repetition by walking you through the forgetting curves. Let's assume you're studying a certain chapter today. The y-axis of the graph represents the memory strength, with a maximum value of 100%. When you study the chapter for the first time, you develop a strong memory. Let's call this the primary memory. But with time, memory strength fades rapidly. This is the normal forgetting curve. Now, let's utilize this knowledge to develop powerful study techniques. Here are two ways to maximize the retention. The first method is developing a strong primary memory. Imagine two students studying for the same exam. One student by hearts the lessons by cramming, whereas the second student understands the concepts by creating flowcharts. It's obvious that the primary memory of the second student is much stronger than the first student. The key to a strong primary memory is understanding the concepts rather than cramming. Flowcharts are one way to achieve this. There are other techniques like creating tables, mind maps, mnemonics, and picmonics. But my favorite technique is creating my own theories. Understanding the concepts before memorizing them is the secret to a strong primary memory. The second secret to a prolonged memory is spaced repetition. When you review the same chapter on the second day, the gradient of the forgetting curve flattens a bit. When you review it again on the seventh day, the slope flattens even further. This pattern of spaced revision is called spaced repetition. It helps to retain facts in memory for longer time periods.
So let's kind of give the neuroscience of that. And we're going to move towards over the next couple of sessions talking about these leaps in learning. Like we've got the rocks of well-being. The leaps in learning are what tips out of cognitive science in terms of learning more effectively, consolidating memory. So let's talk about that idea of a strong primary memory. That's about being much more engaged in whatever you're doing for a period of time. The more attention you can apply to the learning, the more neurons are engaged, the more chance there is of catching that information because there are many more neurons involved. And that gives the hippocampus much more to repattern and refire that night. The other kind of thing in that video, spaced repetition. Now, basically, spacing works because, as I said to you earlier, when those neurons fire, they generate a chemical which travels out to the synapses. That chemical takes time to make and time to diffuse out to the synapses. That time is space, basically. What I mean is, if you space your practice out over time, over minutes, but over days, that gives that chemical time to move out to those synapses. So when the next time that neuron fires, that chemical is there to reinforce and strengthen the connections between those neurons. And spaced repetition as a way of learning works in every species we've studied, from sea slugs, who have got about 365 neurons, to bees, to any organism that's got a neuron. Spaced repetition works because of that chemical. So literally, if we repeat our practice and space it out, we will learn that stuff. We will encode it because we are reinforcing those synapses, and that gets the hippocampus involved. It refires those memories, and they get bound together. And we don't need to do it forever. As you can see on that spaced repetition graph, it's only 3 or 4 times that you need to do it. Thank you for your question. I will answer your question at the end about mindset. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do in order to make sure that happens is we need to have a mindset that know you can grow. So basically, that is this idea that actually whether or not you improve at something is not down to your ability on its own. So let's be honest, we're differently skilled, aren't we? Some of us are better at words, some of us are better at numbers, some of us are better at dance, some of us are at sport, some of us are better socially. We've all got different brains, and that's a skill that comes from the fact that all humans lived in tribes. And if you've got people with different brains in a tribe, across a group of 150 people with all different characteristics and different skills, all those skills together really support the tribe because everyone's got different skills. So that means we're all differently able. And the things that we find easier, the things that we enjoy more. So if we love words or we prefer maths, whatever we do a lot of, basically we get good at that thing for two reasons. One, we've loved it because we love the experience of doing it, because we get a buzz from doing it. There's that kind of learning experience and we love it. That means that we therefore do it more. That means we give our brain more experience of it. That means we encode it more in memory. That means we get better at it. Things we don't like as much, say, like me at school, didn't really like maths, kind of did at maths, was bottom set maths, 23 out of 23 because they publish position in class every 2 weeks. So pretty soon I just convinced myself I couldn't do maths. Therefore, I didn't really do maths. I kind of did at maths, tried to do the homework enough that I didn't get detentions, but really didn't engage with maths. And it wasn't until I had a really good teacher when I was retaking my O-level maths for the 4th time, who just said, basically, mate, you just got to practice. And basically, you will improve anything if you practice, even if it's something that you don't find as easy as the things that you're kind of naturally more able to do. You will improve by practicing. So to answer the question that you put in the box about mindset is actually knowing that you can grow, whether or not you enjoy that particular subject. The repetition of it will mean that you will encode it and you will get better at it. That is the way the brain works. We can't sort of change that. That's literally the way the brain works. So if we're going to improve, we're going to need to practice, and more on those kind of practice sessions later. And then learn as you go is this idea we talked about earlier, understanding that learning is 3 processes, not 1, and that we need to repeat. And the most powerful way to repeat is spacing our repetition out. So how can you improve your daily learning progress as a student that's listening to this? And it's not kind of just more school. There's all this conversation now about catching up after COVID. And obviously that's really important. And we're all worried about children that have missed many days at school and lots of learning. I was talking to some students about it today, and they're kind of really down about it. But there's lots of things that we can do in our own day around this difficult situation to make sure we're remembering more of what we experience. If you want to remember something, you need to repeat it. And if you want to do that, you need to repeat it in a systematic way. If you don't repeat, your brain will delete. This should be a poster on every classroom in the country. Your brain remembers dangerous information, stuff that's interesting, and stuff that's repeated. And if we don't repeat, our brain forgets stuff at this rate. So what we want is we want you to catch more of the learning. So the learning's coming into your brain. It's going through your short-term memory. Remember, as soon as your short-term memory stops firing, we can forget that information. We don't want to just pour more water through your brain, more learning. We want you to do something to capture that information. So when you get home in the evening, if you practice that night, just 25 minutes going back over that learning day, just trying to focus on the concepts, the key ideas that you were being taught, and we'll talk more about this next week and how you might do that, you will start to remember way more information because you'll be telling your brain that this information is important. How does your brain know? Because you've touched that memory once when you were learning it and once when you were repeating it. And if you have outcomes from that 25 minutes of reviewing your learning that are flashcards, you then repeat again and again and again, 4 or 5 repetitions, and it's really heading into long-term memory. The other thing I want to mention briefly before we finish is in order to learn, anything, our brain just needs pairs. It needs to be exposed to the problem or the pattern enough times. Now, for different things, that is the different level of exposure. So, if we're good at reading and we're good at kind of creative writing, we will need less problem and pattern exposure to those problems than if we find maths difficult, we're going to need more problem and pattern exposure. But your brain is designed to solve problems, and it solves them by being exposed to them. We need to engage enthusiastically in whatever that experience is. We need to attend for as full a focus as possible. And if it's something we don't like maths for me, we need to make sure that that practice is regular. So, 10 minutes of practicing maths twice a day is much better than trying to attempt to do 2 hours of practice. 10 minutes twice a day, you'll do that, and that will improve your ability in maths and your recall of maths. And then you repeat and you space pairs. If you create a pairs type environment around your brain, you cannot help but learn. If you think about something you're really good at, I don't know, say you've been practicing different flips on the trampoline. You'll have gone and you've practiced, you've engaged with it a lot, you've attended to it, you've repeated it, you've spaced that out over days. Our brain needs pairs in order to learn anything. And actually, the best way of creating that experience is little and often practice. Okay, so our brains can learn anything. They are statistical learning machines. I've overrun slightly. So next week, we're going to look at how we can turn this process of memory into a systematic kind of process. And I just want to finish with this video about the fact that practice, exposure of the brain to a problem means it can solve any problem. So as you're watching this, just think about the brain. It's being exposed again and again to a problem, again and again to a problem, and it will begin to learn and adjust over time through repetition. But just repeat practice. Now, obviously, these are all physical examples, but it's exactly the same for any academic work. Just repetition, repetition. And in order to make sure we do repetition, we might need to make sure that the repetition is short bursts, because spacing makes that difference. It connects the brain up. And it's amazing. If you just watch this, your brain can learn anything just through repeat activities, slowly but surely. And we can sometimes get in our own way because we don't give our brain enough practice of something because we've told ourselves that we can't do it. What's the point? Actually, your brain can learn anything through repetition, repetition, repetition. Okay, I'll see you all next week. Take care, everyone. It's half term, so have a good half term, but do join us at 7 p.m. next Thursday, where we'll be talking a bit more about memory and how to take this stuff live into your learning experience and remember more of your school day so you haven't got to do loads of cramming as exams approach. Take care. Look after yourselves. See you next week.